Good afternoon. Welcome to the Heritage Foundation and our Lewis Lehrman Auditorium. We, of course, welcome those who join us on all of these occasions on our heritage.org website and remind them that questions or comments can be sent to us at any time, simply emailing speaker@heritage.org. For those in-house, we do appreciate that last check that cell phones are turned off as we prepare to begin. And of course, we will post the program within 24 hours on the Heritage homepage for everyone's future reference. And naturally, since our author will be too modest, we have copies available in the lobby for purchase, and he will be glad to sign them afterwards. That's the Ed Meese line, of course. We are pleased to introduce our special host for today's event, our Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer here at the Heritage Foundation, Phil Trueluck. Please join me in welcoming him. Phil.
This is the first time I've heard modesty and Kim Holmes mentioned in the same.
Now you start ripping off the distinguished fellow title now.
Welcome, everybody. Delighted to see you here. It's a very special occasion. That's sort of a new part of Kim Holmes's career in a way, this book, and I think all of you are going to enjoy it once you get a chance to look at it. I'm delighted you could be up here today and to hear from Kim about his new book, Rebound, Getting America Back to Great. We've also, you might say, who are these other people, because they're sitting up here too. This book is so good, we had to have 3 people come up and talk about it. So Stuart Butler, who I think all of you know, and Marion Smith, you may not know, but you will know of soon, will speak after Kim, and they're going to talk about some of the themes that are in the book as well. As I think many of you know, Kim is a distinguished fellow here at Heritage. He's worked at Heritage for over 25 years, and most of that time he was vice president of our Davis Center for Foreign and Defense Policy Studies and did a great job on that. He also, of course, served, some of you know him from this part of his life, as George W. Bush administration as Assistant Secretary for State for International Organizational Affairs. While he is a foreign policy expert, he's also an historian, and this book, while you might think it's a lot about foreign policy, it's actually much, 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 much bigger than that. I always like to tell this story because it reflects poorly on me, and I think that's always a good thing to do occasionally. Kim has great foresight. I remember the day he came to me, and right before 9/11, a couple of months before that tragedy, and presented me with a new idea about setting up a Homeland Security Defense program inside Heritage. And I'd say it was way before 9/11, a few months. And I said, well, Kim, that's sort of an interesting idea. You know, let's talk about it next year. So 9/11 happens, and of course, Kim calls me up and says, what do you think about starting that task force now? I said, it's really timely. Let's go after it. So, Kim has that kind of foresight, and that's very clear in this book as well. With this book, Rebound, Kim takes a look at the intersection of American culture and American greatness. And many people, as you know, not just Americans, but those in countries that depend upon America, are deeply concerned about the direction our country is going in. Kim's new book taps into these concerns and examines just how America has moved from the principles and practices that has made it the world's greatest nation. Rebound lays out the vision and roadmap of how America can bounce back, with examples from our nation's history that prove we have always been able to meet the challenges that have faced us, no matter how large they are. And as I said, after Kim's remarks, we'll have a discussion by the panel. Stuart Butler is also a distinguished fellow here at Heritage with way more than 25, almost 35 years or so.
Nice.
And these 2 guys are really what ran the research department here for the last 30 years, basically. We rewarded them by making them distinguished, and we'd say we're already pretty much in that. And of course, it's really exactly what we had hoped would happen with these 2 guys has happened. They've reached out, having new projects, new ideas of doing things, and lessened the administrative burdens that they had running those huge departments. And of course, this is exactly, in Kim's case, exactly what we're hoping would come out of the program. This kind of new work that's being done, and also Stuart has his own Center for Innovation now. And Marion Smith is a visiting fellow in our Kenneth Simon Center for Principles in Politics. And as I say, you may not know him well yet, but he is a rising star, and he's certainly a rising star here at Heritage, and we are delighted to have him with us today. Anytime when you look at an introduction of a book and you see the following, you say, must be something interesting inside. There's mention in the introduction of Elvis Presley, Albert Sabin, Doris Day, Charles Murray, G.K. Chesterton, Dwight Eisenhower, George Bailey from It's a Wonderful Life, and Ozzie and Harriet also makes it, and I believe Lucy's in there too. So you know something's going on. Maybe this will be an interesting book after all. That's in the first 2 or 3 pages. Before I turn it over to Kim, Michael Novak did the foreword for the book, and that itself is actually a very interesting part of the book, and I urge you not to skip the foreword, but also take a look at it. He ends up with this quote about the book. This is one of those books that helps to keep the moral light burning in the dark. Argue with it, disagree with it, do better than it if you can, but face the questions for our souls that it sets flickering in the uneasy, restless camps throughout the land. What a wonderful quote about a wonderful book and a wonderful guy. Kim?
Thank you, Phil.
That's very kind of you. I asked Phil to host this event for a lot of reasons, not only because if it weren't for him, I would not be in the new position I'm in where I have this freedom to do the kind of research that's in this book, but also, as I said last night in the reception, Phil, when I was after I'd been introduced by Senator DeMint, I really owe the idea of the outcome of the book to you, because you recall I came to see you early on. I had this sort of half-baked idea of a book I wanted to write, and I kind of went through the ideas with Phil, and I sort of ended up by saying, I guess it's a book about American decline. And there was a pause, and Phil said, you know, it's a bit of a downer. Maybe you should try to look at the other half of it and say, well, okay, that's sort of half the story. What do you do about the situation that you're in? And that's when I got the idea to basically do a book that would learn from the lessons of decline and to avoid decline, and as the title says, rebound back to greatness. I want to thank Stuart and Marion for being here. They're here basically after I make a few points about the books to kind of extrapolate on some of the points I'm making. I'm very happy you're here, so thanks for coming, and thank all of you as well. All right, the book is about, trying to answer 3 questions. One is what made America a great nation? The second is why are we not as great as we once were? And the third is how can we rebound as a nation? How can we get America back to great again? Now, on that first question, what made America great? The answer is obviously complex, but if I had to boil it down, I would do it this way, in one sentence. It was our ethos of personal responsibility that interacted in a positive and dynamic way with 2 characteristics of the American system, and that was our limited government, our constitutionally limited government, and also the free market economy and the the entrepreneurial spirit that went with it. If you look at much of our history, our civic culture was based on the belief that individual responsibility and moral restraint were necessary preconditions for freedom. They provided the social order that actually made the political freedom that we enjoyed as a result of our limited government possible. But they also tamed the wild horses of a free economy. They gave the entrepreneurial spirit a social purpose, turning what otherwise could have been selfish individualism into a policy for the greater good. It was these features, I contend, and not government, that created the wealthiest and the most powerful nation on earth. It's true, if you read the narrative, many historians have written the history of America, it's true that the federal government sold off land, they encouraged the construction of railroads, they fought the Indians to settle the West, they did all kinds of things. But it was not the government, but it was the pioneers, the ranchers, the farmers, and the settlers that provided the energy, the labor and the impetus to settle the great American continent. But the real question is how did we get off track? And that's why I'm glad we have Marion here, because he knows more about this really than I do. But the answer usually starts with the progressive movement and its various offshoots, the New Deal and the like, and that is true. I agree with that. But I also argue in the book that it doesn't explain the entirety of the problem. And so what I do is I identify in the book three key developments that happened largely in the late 50s and in the 60s, which fundamentally changed our civic culture and also our social culture, in other words, our value system. Now, the first of these three is fairly well known. It's the rise and the expansion of the entitlement and welfare states associated with the Great Society programs. This set us on the path of government dependency that is so prevalent today. Its history is well known. I don't want to belabor it, but it is part of this equation. The second is less well known. The second was the rise of the counterculture in the 1960s, which overturned the traditional culture of personal and individual responsibility and replaced it with a new focus on personal freedom defined largely as a kind of personal liberation from the constraints of religion and morality. The baby boomers became, in the 1970s, called the Me generation. It was called the Me decade. Some people called that decade the age of narcissism. And I'm okay, you're okay, it's all about me, what I need. Anybody who lived through that period remembers what I'm talking about. It's true that over time the boomers attenuated the excesses of the 60s, but many of them did keep the core value system of overturning the moral norms of individual responsibility. They became what David Brooks in his book, I think it was of 2000, called the Bohemian Bourgeoisie. He called them the Bobos, that lived out their youthful fantasies in the safety and security of very wealthy suburban neighborhoods. So that was on the cultural side. And the third movement was a political intellectual movement that happened really in the 50s. The roots were in the 50s, but it exploded onto the popular culture in the 60s. And that was the New Left's transformation of modern American liberalism. It took from its previous focus under sort of traditional progressivism, which had focused largely on expanding social programs and government programs, sort of in the 19th century mode of what socialism and progressivism meant. And it changed it to focusing largely on cultural issues. Themes like personal and even sexual liberation, making a cultural critique of capitalism as something which supposedly oppresses one's personhood or inner freedom. There's a lot of philosophy written about this. Antonio Gramsci, the Freudian Marxist Norman Brown, Herbert Marcuse. There was a lot of intellectual roots for this, but it hit the popular culture scene also in the 60s. And it gave rise to what we know today as multiculturalism, diversity politics, sexual politics, gender politics, and even environmentalism seen as largely a spiritual cause, or at least partly a spiritual cause, and not just as the way it used to be seen, is largely about conservation. So what this intellectual movement did is it updated the war, the old socialist war on capitalism and on individual freedom, and it turned it away from the old working class revolution model and turned it into a cultural evolution focused mainly on personal identity issues such as sexuality, gender, and race. Now, what was interesting about all of these three things is they roughly happened during the same time period. And this is important because the combination of all these things happening, the expansion of government, the changing of the value system and the like, it moved away from the idea of individual responsibility as part of our civic culture to that it was okay in various ways to be dependent upon government. In other words, at the same time that we lost our political brakes on the expansion of government, we also were losing our cultural brakes that had existed in our notions of civil society and even private morality that changed during these during this period. And the results have not been pretty. Charles Murray, for example, documents the corrosive impact of the cultural change of values on lower income people in his book Coming Apart. Stuart has done groundbreaking work on the impact of this in his work on social mobility. He'll be talking about that, I'm sure. But what happened, I think, is that the social space that throughout our history, once occupied by civil society, over time, over the last 40, 50 years, became occupied by government. We know one example of this is welfare programs crowding out our social networks. But this transformed the traditional relationship between state and civil society. I call it reversing the polarity of state and society. And what I mean by that is for many in lower income neighborhoods, their connection today is not to civil society but to government. And that means that the bonds of trust are vertical to government. They're not horizontal across society as they have been for much of our history. But at the same time that has been switched, mistrust in civil society is largely horizontal. But it's also become greatly heightened because groups and classes of people now compete with one another politically for government benefits. In other words, people now compete as a competitive classes, gender groups, and even races for that matter. Another thing that's happened as a result of this change is that we changed the idea and the practice of what we mean by virtue. It was historically considered a private matter about how one measured up individually as a person, whether you were a good person or not. And as I mentioned at the outset, that was considered for most of our history a prerequisite of enjoying the benefits of political freedom. But now this idea of virtue has been transformed largely into a political ideology. Now some call it political correctness, but I call it instead political virtue or ideological virtue. And by this I mean that often a person defines their civic mindedness not by what they do personally for their community, for their neighbors, for their society, but rather where they stand on a political issue, which is largely what government can or should be doing for you. And that has replaced the notion of virtue. And so you find that it mainly in matters of race, gender, and sexual orientation, but it's not entirely there. You also find it in other issues as well. But what this does, I think has done, is that it's a trend that it's created essentially a state-endorsed ideology backed up not only by legally enforceable norms in some cases, but just as importantly by socially enforceable norms. In other words, how you define yourself as a good person is much determined by where you stand on some ideological issue. That's why very often it's very hard to have debates with somebody who disagrees with you. It's because it's been transformed in this way. And so I conclude, and I'm going to read this sentence because I tried to figure out a way to say it more succinctly in the sentence, and I couldn't. And that is this, quote, the fairly wide radius of trust that once eased the mutualism of American civil society is now much, much smaller than it used to be for most of our history. And that's the decline in trust that is behind many of the political divisions that we see in our country. And so it is culturally rooted, it's socially rooted, it's not just about opinion. It's also based upon and dependent in many ways your relationship to the benefits that you get from government. Now all of this change, this transformation of our civic and our social culture has created what I argue in the book as a false narrative of American greatness. The narrative that you hear very often today is that the traditional American, the kind I am, what I'm talking about here, is reactionary, and therefore hostile to change, and therefore hostile to the future. It sets up the straw man that any attempt to learn from our past is a de facto attempt to turn back the clock and to make war on the modern world. That's sort of the caricature that you would see. And I argue that nothing could be further from the truth. What we call today traditional American values, the ones that I'm describing here, belief in personal responsibility and individual initiative and that sort of thing, are actually modern ideas. They not only help make America a modern nation, but frankly, as they were applied through the expansion of liberal capitalism across the globe, help modernize the entire world. It's important to remember that when Edison invented the electric light bulb or the Wright brothers flew their first airplane, America was a country of traditional values. The same was true in the 1950s, when America was undoubtedly the biggest and most successful country on the face of the earth. All the traits of modernism, expanding freedom, an experimental attitude, open-mindedness, love of freedom. All these things, these characteristics existed even prior to the New Deal, and certainly existed prior to the counterculture of the 60s. And I believe ultimately they accounted for the rise of America as a great modern nation. Now, the values of the counterculture, on the other hand, I argue are actually, if you go into their history, in particular, if you go into their history, are throwback to pre-modern values in all but name. They arose in intellectual history, in the history of ideas, as part of the Romantic rebellion against the values of political liberty that had been promulgated by the Enlightenment. The focus on the individual being subsumed by the collective gave rise to the totalitarian ideologies of the 20th century, communism and fascism. And they still had one thing in common with the New Left ideologies of the 50s and 60s, and that is that all of them harkened back to the pre-modern, pre-industrial ideal of communalism that they believed that capitalism and the focus on individual freedom had destroyed. So it was at bottom, I believe, in their attack on what they call bourgeois liberalism, the individual freedom of capitalism, that I happen to believe is actually making a war on what really did, in the end, modernize civilization. Now, this is not some debating point. It may sound like it, but it really goes to the heart of the essential liberal argument against American conservatism. It goes to the heart of their argument against what I call classical liberalism. Because liberals claim that conservatives are reactionaries. They do. I think they're wrong. I think because it was, as a matter of fact, it was liberal capitalism that made the modern world. It certainly wasn't socialism, and it certainly wasn't communism, which failed miserably. It was liberal capitalism and the ideas that I'm talking about here that modernized not only America, but the rest of the world. Now, the cultural historian Jacques Barzoun has a theory that I think applies here. He talks about the great divide in American liberalism. He says liberalism was once a philosophy dedicated to more freedom for greater numbers of people. But he says no more. It's changed. He says today it is mainly about denying people freedom supposedly in the interests of society and treating them as group subjects of the state. You see it every time someone tries to stifle speech in the name of tolerance or forces you onto a health care plan you don't want in the name of choice. The words and the ideas have become, according to Barzoun, the opposite of their meaning, which is why today many people who agree with me don't refer to it as liberalism anymore, but illiberalism. Now, the changes of taking this idea of the Great Divide, the changes I'm talking about here occurred not only in domestic liberalism, but also in foreign policy. And I take up Barzoun's theme in the book, and I apply it to what I call the Great Divide in liberal internationalism after the Vietnam War. Cold War liberals in the model of Harry Truman and Jack Kennedy gave way in the 1960s to the anti-war liberals like George McGovern, Eugene McCarthy, Ted Kennedy, and yes, John Kerry. The 1960s divided liberal internationalism. Formerly, prior to the Vietnam War, liberals had been dedicated to the American cause and to the respect for American power. But after the Vietnam War, they came to doubt that cause and to question that power. Now, why is this important? Well, because mainly the residues of this philosophy, of this great divide, is with us today in our president, Barack Obama. He is steeped in the same doubt about American power as other post-Vietnam liberals are. And I think this is frankly confusing him. As president, he sees the intelligence briefings, which show him just how dangerous the world really is to America. But I believe that his instincts tell him that somehow we must be partially responsible for this. And I think this causes a conflict in his mind and confuses him. That's why we get these wild gyrations in some of his foreign policy making. If he's not drawing red lines and threatening Syria with military strikes, he's calling the strikes off and calling a peace conference in Geneva. If he's not killing terrorists with drones, he's bringing them to New York to put on trial in a civil court. I think that this is probably not what he expected when he became president. The first year or so of his presidency, you know, when he was giving the speeches in Cairo and he reached out to the Iranians, I think he tried to apply the philosophy that he learned at Harvard and the University of Chicago and elsewhere, but it didn't work, and it wasn't coinciding with what he was learning from his experience as the commander-in-chief. But he's still, I think, conflicted. So this is not just a theoretical intellectual problem. It's something that we live with every day in the foreign policy of this president. Now, I've had lots of interviews on the book for the last couple of weeks, and the question I almost always get is it too late to turn the country around? And my answer is no, it's not too late. But it's getting awfully close to too late. We are reaching the tipping point where all of the developments that I described before in the culture and also the expansion of government, if you get to a certain point, it's very hard to reverse it. Just look to Europe. The welfare states in Europe are completely entrenched. There's probably no way that they can ever turn that around. But we still have a number of things going for us in this country, more than I can really even list here, and we can maybe talk about more. But one of them is that unlike Europe, the American middle class is still largely independent from government. It's moving in the wrong direction. That's really what much of the fight over Obamacare is about. But it's still, compared at least to the Europeans, more independent and therefore more open-minded to other solutions. And the second reason why I can be optimistic is I firmly believe that the current path that we're on will not work. It just cannot work. The sequester is already showing that something must be done to stop government spending. And the fact is that as much as we try to borrow our way out of these crises, there's just simply not enough money to do that. And besides, doubling down on the mistakes that we've been making is only going to result in even more failures. Now, for this reason, actually 1/3 of the book is talking about concrete policy recommendations that I took mainly from Stuart's Saving the American Dream on the domestic side and from the work of the Foreign Policy Department on foreign policy. So I did answer the question when I was asked, okay, you've been complaining and saying the country's coming to a dead end. What do you recommend we do about it? So 1/3 of the book is a roadmap for a very concrete way out. So I just don't leave you hanging. But this really makes the point that even though a lot of the book is history, even though I'm talking about history a lot, I do so mainly because I think that one of the reasons why it's so hard for us to solve our problems is because we got our historical narrative wrong. We got the narrative of what made America great wrong, and we're stuck by thinking it's always got to be some government program that's going to get us out of this mess. And unless you know the different narrative, you don't have the confidence to believe that something different could possibly be true. So the book is not really about the past. It's actually about the future. It's impossible to resurrect the past. I love Elvis Presley, but that's the 1950s are gone. I'm not going to go back to those times. There's no time machines. Besides that, there's a lot of things in the past, segregation, certainly even further back, slavery, that we definitely want to leave in the past. So this is not about nostalgia. This is about learning from what worked, what didn't work, why did it work, what were the characteristics that worked together, and can that tell us anything now about what we need to do about the way forward? And so it's basically applying lessons from our history to solve tomorrow's problems. In conclusion, I guess another reason why I want to be optimistic is that we have seen many times in our history that the patience of the American spirit has its limits. There are many times in our history when we were facing very dark times and we found a way to turn things around. The most recent in my memory was, of course, what happened with the failure of Jimmy Carter's presidency, which laid the groundwork for the rise of Ronald Reagan. No one could have possibly expected, or few very people, maybe except for Phil Trueluck and Ed Fuller when they founded Heritage, could have expected that it would have happened that quickly. And now that Obamacare is unraveling, this may be a teaching moment for us, or for the American people, I should say, not so much for us. We've been telling people this is going to happen for a very long time, but now they're seeing with their own eyes that it's not working. And the reason it's not working is because it's absolutely utopian to expect the federal agency or the federal government to do all the things that President Obama has promised to do with this plan. So I think it would only be so long before the American people will only for so long abide by a culture that pretends that repression is freedom, that mind-numbing conformity is diversity, and that a kind of primitive intolerance is really a higher form of tolerance. And that's what very often that we hear today. But I do believe that when that time comes, when that moment happens, I believe that's the point where Americans will have a chance for renewal and start thinking about something a little bit differently. So thank you for your attention, and now listen to these gentlemen here. Thank you.
Well, I first of all just want to make sure that that Kim knows that Elvis still lives. So I want to correct that.
Is he in the UK?
But I'm delighted to be here and delighted to make a few comments on Kim's excellent book. As Phil mentioned, Kim and I go back a long way. We've worked together at Heritage for many, many years. We've worked on joint projects together. We've co-edited books together. And we've had a lot of conversations together. And we're both historians, and so we tend to be very interested in these broader issues and the explanations for trends that are going on in our society, and this comes through very, very much in the book. So I think building the case, as Kim does, is crucial to understanding the book and understanding what he's saying about the future. As you might have noticed also, I happen to be an immigrant. I've lived here for over 30 years, but it's interesting when you come to the United States from another country, and I come from Europe, obviously, you're able to maybe see things or be aware of the contrasts that are not necessarily quite so apparent to people who have been brought up here. And there are four in particular that I just want to touch on that really come through very strongly in Kim's book, and I think help explain the crucial nature of the United States and of Americans, and I count myself as one now. One is, of course, as he referred to, that the whole idea of the American view of freedom and personal freedom also goes hand in hand with the idea of personal responsibility, and also with collective action, but collective action in the form of associations, people working together, neighborhood, and so on. And that has been such a crucial part and such a distinguishing feature or distinguishing emphasis of the United States. And as I'll say in a moment, I think when we start looking at what's been going wrong, often we look at the interplay of particularly government action and these kinds of features of Americans. Secondly, of course, the whole idea of constitutional balance and the constraint of government and limited government is well understood in this room, and I don't want to dwell on it, but it's another key element. As is, of course, as Kim said, the commitment to markets and entrepreneurship. We understand in America that personal freedom and action and decisions that people make within an economic sphere are critically important to our ability to grow and prosperity and the opportunity that is the integral part of what America is all about. The fourth item I'd add to this list, which I think is really important and that Kim talks about throughout the book, is really the whole experience of the movement west. America was never and still isn't really a settled country in the sense that Britain is. And if you look at the experience of that movement west, about what it did to Americans who experienced it in terms of the challenges and the opportunities that they faced, and therefore the new structures and new ways of thinking about things and new ways of doing things that were essential to be successful in that movement. And that notion of social entrepreneurship, of figuring out how to do things differently, of being innovative in that sense was so crucial. And I must admit, one of the ironies I've always thought about is that if you look back to the 19th century and look at the role of lawyers in the 19th century, lawyers in the 19th century were there to make things happen, to figure out how to establish property rights, how to divide up water, how to get a rail line actually laid down in an area. They got things going. How different from today, where you can't do anything without incurring the wrath and the effect of a lawyer. So I think you see some interesting aspects there. So I think it's important to just remind ourselves of these very unique features of America. And then when, as Kim says, when you start then looking at what went wrong, it's sort of, one has to think about how does the kinds of changes he talked about impact this nature of America in the United States. And I don't want to go on, of course, over all the factors there, but I think one is to kind of think about how the growth of government, and I don't just mean in its scale, but more importantly in its scope of activities, kind of interacted with some of these aspects of Americans and how that caused so many things to go wrong. Think about the decline of the family and the culture of work and responsibility that Kim talks about, and of course talks about how Charles Murray looks at these things in Coming Apart, his recent book. And then you think about how the welfare system, particularly as it expanded in the 1960s and 1970s, at the same time as the cultural changes that Kim talked about were also happening, how devastating that interaction was. We used to have a welfare system in this country that said, if you have a child out of wedlock, which was, of course, a growing phenomenon, particularly in the 60s, if you have a child out of wedlock, then if you move out of your home and get an apartment, and if you stop working, and if you don't marry anybody who works, we'll give you a check every month. But if you work or marry somebody or go back into the home so you can bring your costs down, then we'll take that check away. And then we wonder why the welfare system has been so corrosive to this fabric of America. And of course, we've made some steps to correct that. But that interaction of government with the cultural change that was going on at the same time has been sort of the perfect storm in the case of welfare. Similarly, we saw the growth of government in its scope crowding out many of these voluntary associations that were so crucial and so much a fabric of America. We used to have, for example, in the 19th century, particularly in the South, little organizations, fraternal organizations, particularly in the African American community, that provided health care to their members. People would put in $1 a month or something like this, and they would hire a physician to kind of deal, it was the beginnings of what we now call health maintenance organizations. But anyway, but they would do this purely. Well, then along comes Medicaid and says, you can have all this for nothing. You don't have to put in $1. You don't have to do all these things. And so one of the effects, despite some of the obvious benefits of Medicaid in its early days, was to undermine these notions of association. We see scores of examples of this around the country. Kim referred to the entitlement mentality. Well, of course, we created, starting in the 1930s, but more especially in the 1960s. Again, the notion that if you qualified for healthcare benefits or some other things, then you were entitled to this in the sense that somehow it was a sacred right. And now when you try to talk to Americans, I've done a lot of town hall meetings on Medicare, and it's not a pleasant sight. When you start trying to challenge so many Americans now about, is there some predetermined right without limit to health care just because you happen to turn 65? You get challenged on this. People say, of course I have this right. Of course it's only proper, and so on. And of course that's been a huge factor in our challenge in terms of facing how do we bring government back under control. And then of course the government has done so many things that has undermined the basic stepping stones or the rungs of the ladder towards opportunity. You look at the public schools of the 19th century and early 20th century in the most rural areas of America. Compare that with an inner city public school today. It is night and day in terms of turning out real Americans and providing skills and so on. We have destroyed predominantly, but not exclusively, through government, these rungs. So when you look at the breakdown, I think this interaction between the way government is operated and its impact on these critical elements of what it means to be America and an American have been so devastating and are so well developed in Kim's book. And as he said, the challenge ahead is to figure out how to both deal with the government side of this equation, but also the cultural side of this equation. We have a dire situation in so many parts of our country, particularly inner cities, particularly for people on the bottom end of the economic ladder, which is, as we said, is an area I'm particularly focused on. We've obviously got to rein in government, both in terms of its scale, but also its scope, to focus on the things that it ought to be doing in the defense and foreign policy and other areas, and get it out of some of these areas where its effect has been on net negative to the very people it was designed to help. It means thinking about how to do that in creative ways, about how you can use the power of federalism to at least move away from the more centralized sort of European vision of the role of government. It also means looking at repairing the ladder of opportunity in this country. And that is very much, I think, a cultural issue as well as a governmental issues, to encourage innovation, to allow innovation, particularly where it's needed most, to not be hampered by regulations and restrictions. Think about higher education, an area I'm very much involved in. We are on the verge of a remarkable revolution in that area in terms of business models, what it means to have a college, the cost. This could have dramatic and beneficial implications if the government doesn't get in the way, which is doing through things like accreditation, through its linkages between giving assistance to people to go through higher ed and saying, well, you're going to go to certain kinds of institutions that we accredit in various ways. So I think this is understanding the steps forward is, in many ways, the most important part of the book in thinking through what the steps are. Like Kim, I am basically optimistic about the future. I think we are in a very serious situation in this country. I think one could imagine a nightmare scenario in terms of what happens and how it eroded. I left the UK in the 1970s because I thought there was no way back in Europe. I left permanently, irrevocably in 1977. 2 years later, Margaret Thatcher was elected, and things changed dramatically. Kim referred to the Carter period and Ronald Reagan, how fast things changed. And it wasn't just in terms of size of government, but Americans' views changed. Their views of what was possible and how they thought about things changed. And I think that can happen today. I think being Americans, we all sort of stumble along trying all kinds of things and going down all kinds of dark alleys, maybe for a little while longer. But if I may just remind you of Churchill's observations about Americans. He said you can always trust Americans to do the right thing after they've tried everything else first. And I think that may be where we will be.
Well, thank you. I was honored to be able to speak about your book on this panel, and I appreciate the invitation. So, in terms of the domestic situation that this book is addressing, it is a decreased sense of self-reliance among the American people and a growing kind of culture of dependency. And that makes, I think, most of us feel a sort of inevitable decline or malaise. But in terms of foreign policy, which is what I'll address, I think what this book is addressing is strategic ambiguity. And in the final chapter on foreign policy, Kim outlines what he views as the main strands in foreign policy thinking today, all of which are incomplete and insufficient in one way or other. And he ends it by saying he's not sure that folks can get over the ideological sort of entrenched battle lines among these different foreign policy perspectives, and says, well, maybe the young folks can make sense of it. So I think that's why I'm here. I'm representing the young folks, and more than half this room are young folks.
That's called punting.
So I think the basic question that I'll try to talk about here, and then I hope we can pick up in the Q&A, and maybe I'll conclude with a question to Kim directly, is whether or not our generation is going to be a good steward of the power and purpose of U.S. foreign policy, assuming there's something left to steward. So along those lines, I think that this book is important for us young folks for three reasons. The first is that it talks about domestic and foreign policy, which you almost never see unless it's a candidate running for office and he's published his book. And then there's a very clear chapter divide where you know he's moving away from domestic policy and he's now talking about foreign policy. Well, in terms of thinking about U.S. foreign policy throughout our history, this is kind of a new approach. We used to call foreign policy statecraft, and that sort of diminished the differences between domestic and foreign policy, because at the end of the day, the same purposes were there. At the beginning, it was to secure the liberties of the American people, and we were doing that through the rule of law domestically, and in terms of foreign policy, securing our independence and military strength to be able to promote the sort of ideas that we would want to promote. And so the problem is that with most people nowadays, so my generation and slightly older than me, I guess, as well. So you're in college, you're interested in international affairs or politics, and you are sooner or later asked, will you be a political scientist and focus on politics, or will you be a political scientist and focus on international relations? And often there's a consequence to that decision. So I think this has, over time, among foreign policy scholars, led to a divide that has been very unhelpful, because it allows people who think quite a lot about American exceptionalism in terms of foreign policy, in terms of domestic policy, to assume a somewhat amoral foreign policy approach and call themselves realists. Secondly, so Kim's book does an excellent job of weaving domestic and foreign policy throughout sort of a grand tour through American history. Secondly, I think that the book does an excellent job of providing a sketch of a social history and the political discourse surrounding some of the great strategic choices in U.S. history in terms of what role the United States will play in the world. And I think what comes through in those episodes that he discusses is that nothing is inevitable. It hinges on leaders who are able to articulate a strategic vision, but that it also depends on public will to support whatever decision is going to be made. So the two most recent examples, I guess, are 1945 and the 1980s. It was not inevitable in 1945 that even though some great European powers had declined as a result of the war, that the United States would take up the mantle and be leader of the free world. That wasn't inevitable at all. And there were voices for pullback and retrenchment, just the way there were after World War I. So understanding why, for example, Harry Truman, a good Democrat, decided that he would have a military buildup and counter the Soviet Union as the only other vibrant and viable threat to American-style freedom in the world, it wasn't inevitable that would take place. So I'll come back to why this is important and why I think you wrote about it in this way. But the same was true in the 1980s. Often good conservatives who love Reagan talk about it all as if it was inevitable, and it certainly wasn't. There were an awful lot of very respected conservative foreign policy scholars who thought that it was perfectly fine to simply contain or coexist with the Soviet Union. Much the way, unfortunately, you hear people talking about China today. China being an authoritarian state that is ruled by a communist party. So I think that for someone my age, or roughly my age or younger, you provide a history that, of course, we've not experienced. And that's very useful, because people my age, we have never lived through an experience that made it hit home to us that peace through strength is actually what carries the day. Because we are, in a certain sense, still living off a peace dividend that was the result of a political will to sustain it and the leadership to make it happen. And I think in the current state of strategic ambiguity, it's uncertain which way it'll go. So I want to be hopeful, but I think that I'm not optimistic necessarily. And that is because year by year, it is people without the sort of history and knowledge that you wrote about who will be making decisions about the role that America will play in the world, the things we want to accomplish, and the sorts of means that we need to make it happen. And then finally, the third reason this book is important, obviously, are the recommendations that you make. And the two main ones, I won't go through all the little ones because you should definitely read the book. But the two main ones, first is military strength, which is not just about military force per se or fighting wars, but that it undergirds all aspects of U.S. foreign policy. And in negotiating rooms around the world, when a U.S. diplomat walks in, there is something about the power of the United States and its military that is also present in the room. And that is a sort of commonsensical observation, but one that is lost on the overwhelming majority of folks writing about foreign policy today. The second sort of overarching recommendation that you make is that in foreign policy going forward, the United States must be a supporter of freedom around the world. And in terms of economic freedom as well as political freedom. And this, of course, draws upon the traditional U.S. foreign policy going back to the Washington administration. And that is also something that is not generally known. The narrative, which you do an excellent job remedying, but the narrative that most people know is that the United States was an isolationist country that just happened to assume the mantle of world leader after 1945. But of course, that's not true at all. We were exercising where we could, where opportunities existed, and as we grew in strength bit by bit, we were exercising the strategic culture and growing a strategic culture that cared about the future of freedom for people all around the world. Now, that was a far cry from saying, like revolutionary France, that we were going to invade foreign people and force them to be free. And the founders didn't want to go in that direction at all. And later, the progressives kind of picked up on that theme, a sort of good-hearted imperialism. And we had a blunder or two in our foreign policy there. But on the whole, the United States cares about the future of freedom around the world. And often that's because we're going about securing our own interest. And so in correcting that narrative, I think the book is invaluable. But basically, the final point I want to make here is that all the recommendations you make are simple. They're not complicated, but they're very difficult. And this is very different than most books on foreign policy that make recommendations. It's very complicated. By the time you're done reading, you don't actually know what they're recommending. But it seems very easy. Again, because you don't actually know what you should do. And I think just to go back to the 1980s, this was seen then as well with Reagan, who shifted the paradigm, and the new strategic objective was not all, the containment and détente and all this complicated stuff about coexisting with the Soviet Union, but simply we win, they lose. Now, that was very simple, but it was also very, very difficult. So in bringing back simple as opposed to complicated recommendations, I think that's great, because this is part of clarifying our strategic objectives and being able to prioritize. But it also will, of course, require statesmanship, which is what we are certainly lacking. But it also requires, again, public will, which I think we're also lacking as well. And I don't necessarily see that my generation is better on this point than the population as a whole. But the only real way to remedy that is for them to understand the foundations of U.S. foreign policy, the tradition that got us to where we are today. And you chart out the growth in GDP from 1940 to 1980, I think. And that drastic growth, which of course depended on greater economic freedom and trade around the world. And who was guaranteeing, in a way, that to happen, at least in the free world? It was the United States. And who would have been doing it had the United States not been guaranteeing that, there's no other good option. And the fundamental dynamic there has not necessarily changed today. If the United States is not going to guarantee the free trade in the global commons and the various sort of bottleneck trade routes around the world, when those are threatened, who is going to guarantee that that trade is going to stay open? There's not a good candidate in terms of our ideas around the world. If the United States is not going to stand for freedom, who is going to promote that? There's not a good candidate. In terms of security that is in favor of or supporting American interests, broadly speaking, there's no good candidate for that either. If America pulls back from any spot in the world, it's going to create a power vacuum. And the other real viable options in terms of sheer power and size have very different ideas of global order and justice than the United States does. So this definitely is about our ideas as well as our interests, the role that America should play in the world. And I think by reading the history and understanding the consequences of following through on those simple but difficult strategic objectives, I think that's the best path forward for us young folks understanding how to think about problems as they arise in foreign policy in this 21st century. So for those reasons, I think you should definitely read the book. It is an important book. And just lastly, I'll ask you a question, and this is kind of about the framing of this. So you talk about a new American diplomacy. And of course, by reading the book, you understand what you really mean as a traditional American foreign policy.
Yes, new is in the sense it's different from what we're doing now.
But that's the paradox in a way is that for the last 50 years, a new orthodoxy has gained control of the State Department and other institutions of U.S. foreign policy that really is fundamentally at odds with the previous century and a half of foreign policy thinking. So explain maybe what you mean by this new American diplomacy.
Yeah, well, this goes back to a few years that I spent when I was at the State Department. I was Assistant Secretary of State for international organizations. Like a lot of people who've never been in government, I had some preconceived notions about what the State Department was, what our foreign policy was. And when I got there, it was a bit different than I expected. I was a bit surprised by what I was learning. And the takeaway from my experience there, plus the studies that I've done over the years, is that this divide I talked about in my presentation that happened over the last 50 years, it primarily happened, if it happened to the Democratic Party, it affected their approach to internationalism. But it wasn't just them. It wasn't just Democrats. It was actually the whole establishment of the United States that was reflected in the way the State Department looks at international relations, and many of the value systems that now are quite commonplace in the European Union, in the United Nations, that there is something inherently wrong with national sovereignty is one of the ideas, that foreign aids from government to government is just simply the only way to redress the inequality between nations in the world. A lot of these ideas came out of the AID was created in the 1960s, came out of that period. And it's almost as if the State Department political culture is frozen in time. I sometimes make a joke, it reminds me of sort of like the lime green period of the 70s. Even the building looks like that. And they won't try anything new. It seems so out of date and so old-fashioned about the way they think the world works and the way government works and the way intergovernmental affairs works. And of course, the whole Foreign Service is trained this way. But it's not just their fault. That's the way the rest of the world operates, and particularly the Europeans, who are probably the most effective diplomats in the world. They and the Russians are much more effective as diplomats, I might have to say, than ours are. In some ways, our diplomats are always kind of playing catch up with their concepts of what our interests should be. It means we disarm ourselves from the get-go. I remember when I went over to the State Department and I had my bureau together, and I gave a speech and saying, I'm your new guy, your new boss. And by the way, it's okay sometimes to lose a vote in the United Nations. I said that. You could have heard a pin drop. They thought, what? this means this is a defeat for America if you lose the vote. But of course, what that really meant is that we had to accommodate ourselves mainly to the 27 or so countries in the European Union who were telling us what a victory was. And so we had to go along with it because we were one vote and the rest of the world, this is at the United Nations I'm talking about. And that kind of accommodationist view was not even a question. And so if you had a vigorous view of trying to win the debate diplomatically, I'm not talking about bullying people or going in there and being rude. I'm just talking about actually representing American interests the way most diplomats represent the interests of their own countries. The Russians are very, very good at this. I believe in some ways the Russians are the best diplomats in the world because they are absolute masters at completely masking their own self-interest in the good of the international community. They know how to do that a lot better than we do. We actually adopt the views of the international community and call them our own. We do it the opposite from what the Russians do. That's what I'm talking about. It's more of a mentality. There's certain practices about things that I talk about in the book that the European Bureau is too big. There are certain global, there's a whole section in the State Department dedicated to global issues, which is too big. And it becomes sort of internal lobbying agencies through the interagency process for changing America, foreign policy away from its own interests. That's what I mean. All right, thank you, gentlemen, for that. I appreciate your comments and your observations. Now it's your turn. Well, let's see. We got three here. Go ahead. Do we have any mics? Yeah. If you could identify yourself, appreciate it.
Hi, Chris Rumkey, Capilano. A couple comments for Stuart. I, like Stuart, I'm an immigrant to the United States and a proud citizen. I escaped Canada in 1989 from Trudeau and the liberalism that was running wild there. And just like the Margaret Thatcher experience in Britain, we had a small party out of Alberta, pro-business, effective government, came out of nowhere out of Alberta and took over the National Conservative Party, which was almost indistinguishable from the Liberal Party. And now Canada has a higher GDP than the United States has. And I wish the Republican Party would stay focused like a laser on pro-business, sensible government policies rather than social issues, and we would see a big revolution here as well. A quick comment on the myth of America and free trade. That would be a big shock to the founders of the United States to hear that, because that's a mythology. If you look at every major city in the United States, one of the most impressive buildings is the Customs building. And why is that? Because they had massive tariffs on all foreign products manufactured coming from Europe to make sure we had manufacturing in the United States. What does that sound like? It sounds like China to me, doesn't it? And of course, there was a civil war between the South, which was free trade with Europe, and the protected industrialized North. And if we don't watch out, it's going to be a replay between China and ourselves. And that to me is the most important issue to focus on the rebirth of America, get our economy fixed, and stop this nonsense with China. Thank you.
Okay. Let's let that as a comment. Jim, do you have something?
It's Jim Phillips. I'm a senior research fellow here at Heritage. And Kim, congrats on the book. It seems like a fundamentally optimistic critique and statement of how to proceed.
It's at least hopeful.
Yeah, hopeful, and the sense that it's not too late. But there's a kind of a fashionable narrative, I think, in Washington and many Western countries, and I think including some conservatives, of a sense of inevitable drift and decline, going back to Paul Kennedy and the decline of empires, and this kind of Spenglerian gloom. And how would you refute this narrative of decline, and what choices would you advocate making to kill this narrative?
Well, I think one of the last phrases of the book is American decline is a choice, not a destiny. In other words, and this is true actually of all great nations that rise and decline, somewhere along the line the people or the ruling classes made choices And those choices ended up having the nation go into decline. I was trying to make the point, it's like not a natural law or anything, it's something that we do and can choose to do. We have a number of things going for us that we should not forget. We're still the technological leader of the world. We still have, in many sectors of trade and industry, we still are the dominant innovator in the world. If we do the right things and take advantage of what's happening in energy, for example, we could become the Saudi Arabia of natural gas, but we're not doing the right things. But we have that potential and that option there to us. We, as I mentioned a couple of times, the American middle class has still got enough of that old spirit to make a comeback, so it's not too late there. And also, notwithstanding your pessimism, Marion, about the young people, I mean, I know young people, they love their irony, they love their technology, and they love their freedom. Many of them are libertarian in their values. I get all that. But also, frankly, you guys got a lot more together than my generation did in the 1970s. When if you read history about or read the biography of Steve Jobs, for example, I mean, in his personal life is a complete basket case. So I'd like to keep his his love of style, his innovation, his experimentation. That part of the counterculture I love. But what we need is a self-destructive personal philosophies that he and others represented. And I don't see that in your generation. I just don't see it. It's not only that, it's also that you have people of your generation fought honorably in two of our nation's wars and sacrificed yourselves in ways that frankly are just as honorable as the so-called great generation of World War II. So I'm not ready to give up on it. I think actually in cultural affairs, it's going to be young people who are trying to figure the way out of this cul-de-sac we're in on culture. It's not going to be people my age. You're going to figure out how to apply the universal principles that we're talking about here in a fundamentally new and different way that solves problems that you're interested in, that deals with the things that you're interested in doing, and even preserves the lifestyle choices that some of you have made. That is where I think you can find a way to march through the institutions like the New Left, and like many of the baby boomers did in the 1960s, which was a cultural phenomenon. They took over the universities, they took over the mainline churches, they took over Hollywood, and they took it over not as a political project. It wasn't like I got together in a room and figured out, well, how are we going to conspire to do this? It would just happen naturally because that was part of the sense of the cultural rebellion that was going on at the time. It's happened in music and other arts as well. So that's going to have to happen, I think, almost spontaneously and from the grassroots up. It's certainly not anything government can organize. I would not want the government to be organizing a cultural revolution. It sounds like Mao Zedong or something like that.
I would just underscore this just very quickly. I mean, I think Kim's right, both in terms of the underlying potential, the underlying fabric of America that is just ready, I think, to burst in the right direction. Along the lines that he said, we see this. You don't quite know what it's going to look like, but I feel the same way about that. And then just again to underscore how quickly things can change in a positive direction. And we've seen this both in terms of politics, but more particularly sort of how a nation can just really change. I mean, for those of us who are old enough, I mean, just to have experienced sort of the last couple of years of the Carter administration and the first 2 years of the Reagan administration, it's almost impossible to kind of explain to people the difference in terms of how people started to think and what was possible and so on. And I think that can happen again. I mean, young people tend to be gloomy sometimes because they don't have that perspective by definition. But I think those of us who do can probably have a lot more confidence that things can turn around in this country.
I know that the phrase neoconservatism today means something different than what it originally was, so I hesitate to talk about this, fear I'll be misunderstood. But in the 1970s, the neoconservative movement with Irving Kristol, Patrick Moynihan, many Podhorse, many of these people in the 50s had been socialists.
Yeah.
And not just liberals, but socialists. And it was that experience that flipped them entirely, intellectually, over to the other side. And if you can't find a greater distance to travel from socialism to neoconservatism, as they understood it, I can't find one anything greater than that. You had a question, sir?
Yeah.
Put you on the spot. If you don't, it's all
Yeah,
right.
no, I did, but
Yeah.
someone
Yeah.
actually mentioned it was the trade issue and the deindustrialization of America, which
Yeah.
all of our strength depends on that. And even the breakdown of our families, Charles Murray, when you've got middle-class people where everybody in the family has to work, there is no family life because one income can't support them on service jobs. That breaks down the family and causes the kind of downward spiral that we have. But actually, I was curious about the cultural war, because I agree with you. It's been fundamental and it's ongoing, and they seem to control, as you said, the media and the culture, and it's pretty prevalent. I heard David Horowitz speak here earlier this week, and he came from the New Left, and his parents were communists, and he makes the point that the left are mendacious. I mean, they're liars. They're not honorable. They're not philosophers. They're really bad people. I mean, that's his take. And they're communists, most of them, actually, despite they call themselves progressives or socialists, whatever they want to call themselves. He for naming names. And I think of the power of that when Reagan said, "Take down the wall. This is an evil empire." I think of the sort of power that seemed to have historically to name them for what they were. And I wonder if the American conservative people should be more outspoken and name names. And if we're playing too soft with them, we think they're honorable opposition when they aren't. What's your thought about that? That sort of Horowitz approach to the cultural wars.
Well, rather than name names, I'd rather expose ideas. Because once you start using names and labeling people, you start arguing over the labels rather than the ideas behind them. I fully understand what you're suggesting is that they're pretending to be something they're not. And therefore, if you don't go to the core of what they're pretending to be, you're missing the point. I get all that. I also know, though, that if you start throwing around names and labels, I know they do it to us. I got that. But I also know that if you're trying to persuade people who are on the fence, and that's really what the business that we should be in, people who are not actually the combatants in the intellectual wars or cultural wars, but people on the sides, or average American, it's better to be optimistic, it's better to be upbeat, and it's better to be straightforward about what you believe in, and try not to engage in name calling. That's just my personal belief. I've been in arguments with people, and when it gets to the point where you start calling each other names, that's usually when the argument's over.
Can I just, I wouldn't want you to think that I'm pessimistic. So I think the South Carolina state motto sums it up best: dum spiro spero. Why breathe? I hope. You're going to stop breathing sooner or later, which means you're going to die, but you should be hopeful until then. I am hopeful, but Baker, I want my generation to understand that it's not predetermined. It's not inevitable that we're going to pull through this time again. So in a way, it's just it's up to us. It's up to us. That's my only point there. And then just really quickly to your comment about the founders on trade. You are correct that there were tariffs. There was also zero internal taxation. But the goal was freer trade, and they balanced two priorities: reciprocity and free trade. With all the trading partners, and the international system, of course, was a mercantilist system with the powers of Europe. So their stated objective was freer trade. And it's a wonderful sort of case study in prudence in terms of economic statecraft, how you go about achieving that. So it would be I wouldn't want you to say they weren't pure free marketeers immediately in policy for the first 30 years, and therefore we can't learn anything. The fact is the American commitment to free trade, as opposed to the British free trade system within the empire, the mercantilist system in a way, but it wasn't really free trade. They helped shift the international order more towards a free trade system. So that's remarkable.
I would just, if I could again respond to you, I'm in Kim's camp on that, in terms of, I think that, the most effective way to roll back a bad idea, a bad philosophy, I think historically has been to show show as clearly as one can its internal contradictions and the difference between what it promises and what it delivers. Again, I'm from Europe. The communist system and the socialism that pervaded the society that I was brought up in and was prevalent in Europe was not name-calling or naming names. It was just showing the absolute contradiction between the vision of society that was promised and what actually happened. And I think we see that. Think about right now, the conversation, if that's the right word here, in the country right now about healthcare.gov and the Obama legislation and so on. What is it that's people are rebelling against? It is the disconnect between what was promised to people and what is actually happening. And that absolutely is driving a wedge. And I think that was true if you look at the breakdown of socialism and communism in Europe the same way. So I think focusing on idea, one's got to have good idea. Our vision and our ideas fit and strike a chord with Americans. And the alternative vision can and is being seen for its sort of phoniness and its, like I said, its internal contradiction. It seems to me that's the way to drive towards success. And that's what I hope we will see younger people in America beginning to kind of really focus on. And that's what will cause the kind of rebound that Kim is writing about.
Baker, I'm going to call on you, but I've been waiting to make two real brief points for something he said, and I will let you jump in. Stuart, you made 2 points. One about the nature of collective action as it was practiced through, I think you called it social entrepreneurship and civil society. That's the way, for most of our history, we solved our social problems. And I think that's right. And so you're not, and I think I know why you're raising it. If I've got it wrong, you can correct me. It's because there's this myth out there that if you believe in individual freedom and personal responsibility, that all you really care about is sort of selfish you. And that you don't really have an alternative for society or for the community, and nothing could be further from the truth. But my little input here is that I studied intellectual history, the history of ideas. So I always have a tendency to go back and try to find out where did these ideas come from. And to me, it's satisfying to know where they came from, at least explain something to me. I hope it does for you. But I just say, in this sense, that one of the most pernicious influences on, in my opinion, on American political culture has been German idealism. It happened through the progressive movement. It happened through Hegel, influence on Wilson and people like this, because what happened was they changed that notion of collective action into state action. And they created the sense that it was, and it's this German ideal of the state. I studied German history, and they believed that the state is the highest moral expression of the community, that it actually exists as almost above and beyond the people. It's sort of an idealistic representation of their goodness. This is what Hegel was talking about. Marx got it and flipped it around, but that's what Hegel's talking about. And now that idea is almost more or less unquestioned in America today. Well, of course, if the government is doing good. President Obama talks about it all the time. Talks about, the good the government is doing. And if we happen to question it, we're actually somehow questioning the communitarian ideal behind it, which of course is not the case. The other point that you made about the law, I have a section in the book about the history of American law and how we looked at the law. And you are absolutely right. It was mainly a functional, practical thing about getting things done, making the free market economy work, property rights, and all that is true. But the other thing is that for most of our history, most Americans were not touched by the law of the federal government except in times of war. It was mainly the local government. They may be touched by the governor's laws, the state laws, certainly if they lived in a town, the laws of the cities. But the laws was very decentralized. And now we've got this notion where the federal government represents the law, and this attitude that the rule of law is now the twin sister of the responsibilities of the federal government to provide benefits. And that if we challenge the government's role, we're actually challenging the rule of law. I mean, after all, when President Obama says this is settled law, I think he was speaking this morning, he was unsettling the law by changing, I believe, some things that were in it. But he can change the law, nobody else can. But there was this attitude, And there is this attitude that somehow if the federal government passes a law and the executive branch puts the regulations out there and implements them, that's it. That's over with. That's now the rule of law. That is not the way for most of our history we even looked at law. And so that's also a fundamental change. Baker.
Bakerson with the Heritage Foundation, a direct follow-on to the previous question, which is to look at the question of the sociological processes. That is that it's clearly, at least certainly my view, and I think it's pretty widely accepted, that the processes of politics and governments are largely speaking zero-sum games. And what happens with regard to the market and civil society is largely speaking a non-zero-sum game. Perhaps the way out, and this is what I'd like you to comment on, with regard to the rebound, is whether there's the possibility that the American population as a whole will find that the very uncomfortable position, I think it's widely viewed that it is today, of political confrontation and gridlock is actually the direct product of excessive reliance on politics and government.
He's asking
Oh,
you
he's
the
asking
question. Well, if you,
Start.
okay.
We'll see if you're correct.
Well, I think it is, but I think it's mainly because, as I think I explained in my remarks, is that as you have a couple of things happening, as you have people more dependent upon government benefits. I think it's now 49% of Americans, either directly or indirectly, get some benefit from the government, and obviously, the more that number goes up, the more people are going to start voting for more benefits. I mean, I had a congressman tell me yesterday at breakfast. He comes from a state where a rural district. He says, I got farmers in my district who are as socially as conservative as they come, but they want the farm bill passed and they want their subsidies. So there's a complete disconnect there, and that's happened because of the expansion of government. And whereas that schizophrenia, if you will, in our culture would not have existed prior, now it's still there. And it's happened certainly on Medicaid, Medicare, and even on Social Security. So that's clearly a factor. I think that's what you're driving at. But I think also, though, is that by expanding this mentality that that certain groups of people and the identities that are associated with their groups, whether it's race, whether it's gender, sexual orientation, or whatever, they start getting their political identity represented by that group. And therefore, the government becomes their protector of their identified rights in that group. And the whole power of the courts and the rule of law is applied behind that. That is fundamentally a socially divisive phenomenon. It not only pits them against each other in competing for those government benefits, for those tax dollars, for that approval, whatever it is, but it also pits them against people who are outside of the group that are not even part of the struggle. And this is socially divisive. That's why I spend some time upon this in the book. And it's socially divisive because it essentially politicizes what used to, in civil society, used to ameliorate these differences through the community in some fashion. Now, let me say very quickly, I'm not talking about tolerating discrimination either against gender groups, race, what I'm talking about. But I'm talking about the way it gets politicized and the way it works out in our political culture. There are ways of protecting the individual rights of women and blacks and other minorities through the rule of law other than making them special protected groups of the court system and the law. I may be wrong about that. I got that.
No, I don't think that's wrong. I want to pick up on the other kind of dimension, I think, of what you were getting at, though. Well, first of all, I would say Kim's absolutely right. The growth of the scope of government, as I refer to, kind of has this effect of luring in, sucking in, seducing people into identifying with governmental roles, their own protections and their own livelihood. I mean, we always used to joke on the sixth floor about farmers, they're capitalists in the morning and they're socialists in the afternoon because they always want to have the best of both worlds as far as they're concerned. But I think this issue of Americans' view of government, I think we may well have gone past the tipping point in this sense. I think until, maybe a few years ago, maybe more recently than that. I think Americans' kind of recipe for fixing the problem was to somehow send the right people here and shake the government up and get it to work properly. Americans always want practical solutions. That's their kind of natural instinct. I think, and I may be wrong, but I think Americans are now coming to the conclusion that government just actually can't do certain things. If it can't run a flaming website, and if it can't figure out what to do in the world, when all this is going on in the Middle East and so on, maybe it just can't do it. Maybe it isn't a problem that we've elected the wrong people, or they weren't either liberal enough or conservative enough or whatever. It's inherently unable to do it. We kind of that's really what happened if you look at the history of the view of government with regard to welfare. I would say that's true. You go back into the 50s and early 60s, and the notion that if we just passed the right laws and spent enough money, I mean, the Great Society, the War on Poverty, was all enshrined this. The right thing to do was to have the government do this. After all, damn it, the government had come in and established civil rights and had to do that. Therefore, it has to feed people. It has to make sure they have medical care. And over a period, I think people came to the conclusion, kind of up to, really Clinton, saying, well, maybe it's not just a question we're not spending enough, or don't have enough will. And so, no, there's something fundamentally wrong with thinking that this is the right way. And it's not to suggest there's been some radical change in the welfare system, but I certainly think that you did see this change of view. And that's what I certainly hope will happen, and I suspect is going to happen as part of this equation. This notion, this ratcheting down of confidence in government is at an all-time low, and people will say, oh, because they're always arguing with each other. But I think they're coming to the conclusion it's probably more than that. It's just not able to do this stuff. And we've got to figure out another way. Even if it's a lower level of government, that's another way. But maybe there's other solutions. I think that's kind of where we're probably going.
Can I just say one thing? I think the correct relationship here is that an excessive dependence on government plus a commitment to the rule of law and democracy leads to gridlock. Mm-hmm. And that's kind of what's missing, actually, is an understanding that, well, you see it. You see it in op-eds who talk about the Chinese model, how efficient it is. So if we are going to have excessive dependency on government, let's just hope that our commitment to the rule of law is strong enough to survive our pragmatism.
Yeah.
So this is...
I think that's absolutely right. And there's another thing that I don't know what to call it, fiction, myth. There's somehow this idea that that we can control the government because we use the democratic process, the ballot box, to elect our representatives, and so therefore we don't fear it all that much. And the problem is that once it reaches a certain size, which it already has reached, and particularly the federal government, and you really have large parts of the federal bureaucracy pretty much writing the details of the laws these days through the regulations and the like, and the people who write them are completely unaccountable. They're not elected, and the authority on the details of writing the laws has been sort of farmed out to these people. And they are controlled by the President of the United States, which is elected way up here on 60,000-foot issues, and the details of what they're dealing with is not really accountable to that president. And so I think that is something that we've gone through periods of our history where the light has gone off and they realize is that, well, the government really can't do all these things. It's not very good at it, and then there's a much more view of accountability wanted to be held on it. And I think we may be on the verge of that happening as the Obamacare falls apart. But the other thing is that I look upon what's happened with President Obama over the last few years is, maybe I'm wrong, but it seems to me, it feels like an historical anomaly. It's almost as if all the trends in the rest of the world are going this way, and he's going this way. The welfare state in Europe has reached its bitter end. I just saw the day where the French and the German economies are slowing down again at 0.3% or so growth. The euro is in constant crisis. Debt is not just Greece, but the Italians and elsewhere. I mean, there's no future there. And yet that's precisely the road the president has taken us down with many of his programs. And at the same time, in technology and business practices, networking and decentralization, entrepreneurship of individual groups, flattening management structures, all this is happening throughout industry and the business world, and it's even happening in Europe, where they're starting to privatize many of their old welfare state programs. In Sweden, for example, this is happening. It's happening in Finland. All these trends are going this way, and we're going this way. Now, why is that? I think it was partly because at the time that he was elected president, there was a financial crisis. We all know that story. He came along, inspired many Americans. I don't think he really knew what to do about it. He had this basic idea of using stimulus spending, didn't work. And then, of course, there was disappointment with the Iraq and the Afghan wars, which completely tanked the Republican brand. And even since then, I would say, and now I'm getting out on a limb here politically, I think that the president, one thing that he politically has realized is that if he does these things which the Democratic Party wanted to do for many years, like health care reform and other things, which from the standard of where the political center of the country had been, is moving the country to the left, he knew that there would be a reaction on the right, which actually has split the Republican Party. And I don't know if he knew that or not, but I think he's figured out that it does. In the sense that there's the establishment politicians who kind of want to get along and get things done, and there's those who think that the country's been taken too far, and we all know how that works out. So I think he's politically a genius. But I do believe that, on the other hand, there may be limits to that genius. I think it may be running out of steam because I think that model is not working anymore. Mainly because, as I said at the outset of this remarks, is that in terms of governance and the policy, he's actually taking us backwards to things that were tried and failed in the past. It's not even with the trends of much what the rest of the world is doing. Anybody want to have any final comments? Before, because I think we're running out of time here. I could do this for another 2 hours, but I think the audience is getting tired. Right? Well, thank you for coming. Thank you. Please buy the book. Yeah, I hope you will. John will appreciate it if you do. John is our publisher. Right here, John Sisk from Roman Littlefield. Thank you, everybody, for coming.